Children's Institute released the report titled Out of Harm's Way, Tracking Child Abuse Cases Through the Child Protection System. The report looked at current legislation, gaps in the system, and whether social workers and police were working together effectively to stem the tide of child abuse cases. Tonight we'll be speaking to the author of this report along with two other stakeholders who work in the child protection system to see what are the gaps, what is working, what isn't, and whether any changes need to be made. But before that, let's have a look at some of the highlights from the report.
We all want a South Africa where children are safe. So we are determined to build a country which protects its children from violence and fear. Only then will long-term growth and development be possible. 1 in 3 children in South Africa is hurt by their parent or caregiver. 1 in 5 will experience sexual abuse before they turn 18. The impact is devastating on children, families, communities, and the country. To reach our potential as a nation, we must end this violence against children. Violence against children comes at great personal and economic cost. Children feel the lasting effects of violence as pain, depression, fear, and anxiety. Children who experience violence are more likely to use drugs, to be depressed, or to use violence themselves. The effects are long-term. Research shows that children will earn less as adults if they were bullied, insulted, beaten, raped, abused, or neglected. Many of South Africa's deep social problems could be prevented if our children were not exposed to violence. The South African government spends more than 126 billion rand a year on policing and the criminal justice system, but just 9 billion on programs to prevent violence. We must change our spending priorities and fund more violence prevention programs. Politicians need to lead the way by speaking out consistently and often to condemn all forms of violence against children. Government, communities, NGOs and researchers need to work together to invest more in the social, economic, and psychological well-being of our children. Let's spend more money on violence prevention that is proven to work. Reducing violence will take time, and it may not be easy, but it has to start now. We cannot allow another generation to carry the burden of violence. We have an urgent message for all politicians. Ensure your party commits to preventing violence against children. Speak out in an informed way and join our commitment. What is your commitment? Join us and say no to violence against children. Share your commitment and let's mobilize our leaders to do the same.
Welcome back. You're watching The Woman Show, and tonight we're speaking about child protection, and specifically the child protection system in South Africa. What we're going to be doing is unpacking how prevention and child safety works and how child abuse cases move through the child protection system. And with me in studio is Valdi van Reenen. Welcome back. Valdi is the former director of the Trauma Center and current director of the Violence Precention Agency. We've got Kath Brink, who is the founder of Little Brinks, which is a safe house for children who have been exposed to abuse, and Lucy Jamieson, who is a researcher at the UCT Children's Institute. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Kath, I'm going to start with you. You run a number of projects, but one of them is a safe house for young children, I think between 0 and 4 years old, who have been exposed to abuse. Can you just tell us a little bit about what Little Brinks does and also what kind of cases you see?
Little Brinks started in 2008 when we we got to see how many children were being abused and neglected throughout Western Cape. And from there, it's kind of snowballed and gotten very big very quickly because there is such a need for help for these kids. Our safe house started off just going to be from 0 to 4, but it's gone right up to 17 now, years old. And there's a lot of abuse and neglect. I mean, there's more neglect because parents just don't know how to be parents. And we're growing up in a society, well, they're growing up in a society where parents are very selfish and they just don't know, because foster care is a cycle, it's an ongoing cycle, and until you break the cycle, it's never going to change. So these kids are brought up not knowing how to be in a functioning family, and then they're going to have children. So our safe house is constantly full because there's such a need at the moment, especially in Western Cape, for safe houses and foster care homes.
So Valdi, and Kath, that's very interesting because I often bring up with Valdi that a study you did with the trauma center on children brought up that parents don't know how to parent or struggle to parent.
Absolutely.
And then, so on that, you started the Violence Prevention Agency, and can you tell us about the need for violence prevention in South Africa and what the organization does?
I think one of our biggest challenges at the moment is that we react to violence against children. We don't look at how we can equip to prevent. And to focus on that would be all round beneficial to everyone. It will help us with our budgets because we would not then spend so much on reacting, which takes a lot of money. And then we can push that money into places where we can truly do a lot of capacity building. So we reached a point where we could no longer come to terms that our only reaction to the violence that children were exposed to is to say trauma counseling. We realized that trauma counseling, as good as it is only one way of perhaps preventing recidivism, but not the only. And we had to look at other forms of healing that were operating in the communities that was supporting children. So, you know, that took us to the issues of what is it that the National Plan for Children is looking at. And it's looking at reacting rather than to preventing. And that is when we decided that actually we need to begin to speak more about violence prevention. Very often people forget or people assume that because it's Violence Prevention Agency, it's a structure and it's a government structure. No, it's not. The word agency is there because what we are saying is that you cannot eliminate, you cannot reduce, you cannot, you cannot deal with violence unless you start with yourself as humans. So how do we begin to say and reflect on our own actions, on our own thinking, and position ourselves in terms of our thinking around violence and our own violence that we perpetrate? Because violence has become so normalized that we don't even think that not feeding that child is violent. We just accept 𝗦𝘆𝘀𝗁𝗃𝗁𝗁. There's no food in the house, so, but we don't see that as violent. And we reached a point where we said, actually, there's a step before trauma counseling, or that perhaps works parallel with trauma counseling. And that is to take people firstly to their own experiences of violence, both as a victim and as a perpetrator and perhaps as a bystander. Because unless we can be true and real about our own violent tendencies, we cannot help others. And I'm not saying that violence is always necessarily an evil. And a lot of people, when I say that, they're like, huh, what you say? What I'm saying is that sometimes violence is a catalyst. Violence enables people to reach out, and I've seen it in the communities when mothers' children are murdered and they start an organization. And they say, I'm not going to allow another child to go through what I've gone through. I'm not going to allow another mother to go through what I'm going through. Had it not been for the death of that child, they would not have taken that position. They would have sat in their cozy world and life would have just gone on. So, you know, as Paulo Freire speaks about critical emancipation, we've moved to say we need not a neoliberal, not a neo-colonial, and definitely not a neo-apartheid approach to working with children. And that's some of the challenges that we are seeing itself played out. There's another interesting report that was released in 2019, and that report has indicated that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, #1. So very, very often the violence that our children are seeing come from the systemic and structural violence that they go through, that their parents go through, that their grandparents have gone through. And we just feel in this country we need to begin to focus to a greater extent on how do we prevent violence, how do we shift people's mindset, how do we get people to move from reacting constantly in a violent mode to look at other ways of dealing with their challenges.
And that's interesting. Lucy, just to come to you, I know that violence prevention has featured heavily with the UCT Children's Institute's work. And I remember in one of the publications, actually, there's the triangle that's been flipped around as a model for what we should be doing. But one of the ways to tackle prevention is to also know where we're going wrong and what the gaps are. And you authored a study and a paper that was released in 2017 called Out of Harm's Way, Tracking Child Abuse Cases Through the Child Protection System. And it was pretty mind-blowing. Because within that you got data to Department of Social Development or social workers and police who are at the coalface really of child abuse. They are first responders, actually. Can you tell us about some of about the publication, what it looked at, and also some of the groundbreaking findings that were in there with regard to the gaps that we are facing?
So let me just link that into the conversation that we've had before. We all want to see a focus on violence prevention. It is much better for children not to experience violence than for us to respond afterwards. The challenge is that levels of violence in this country are so high that the people who would be doing violence prevention work are busy doing that response. And we've got to, you know, if you have a social worker who is faced with a child who has experienced abuse and having to deal with that versus trying to run a program to do prevention, well, the child who's been traumatized comes first. I mean, that's a very simple example of the kinds of tension that the people who work in child protection are facing. There are so many current cases of children who've experienced abuse that we never get round to doing the vital work of prevention. So it's also important to note that responding to children who've experienced violence is an important part of prevention in and of itself. Kath, you mentioned the intergenerational effects. So violence is a cycle. If you experience violence as a child, you are likely to go on, and it's very gendered. So if you experience violence as a child, boys are likely to go on to perpetrate violence, whereas girl children are likely to tolerate violence in their own domestic relationships. So we see that they, women who experience child abuse are more likely to be the victims of domestic violence, but then they also, as you were saying, perpetrate violence against their children without even realizing it. So, smacking, violent measures of discipline or parenting are commonplace, but particularly pronounced in people who've experienced violence themselves. So dealing with violence is, South Africa has deemed it the first step to respond, but we're not doing it very well. So we wanted to look at what happens when a case of child abuse is reported to the police or social services. And we studied both the administration systems, we looked at how the authorities dealt with the case and what the kind of outcomes for children and families were. And the first point to note is that often children don't get into the child protection system. So attitudes or caseloads frequently bar children from laying a complaint of violence at the police, particularly if it's involved in their family. So police were frequently dismissive. No, don't come here. This is a domestic matter. Go sort it out. That was number one. Then we found that when children did manage to get into the system, that often those cases were lost. So a shocking statistic for me was that when we looked at the registers, so social services keep a note of the cases that have been reported to them. And when we looked at those and we asked for the files that were listed in their registers, they could only find 44% of those case files. Now, that other 56% are real children with real families who are experiencing abuse, and that abuse is bad enough that they made it into the system. So one, they had the bravery to go and report, which most children and families don't. We know that with women, it's about 1 in 9 women who report. It's even less for children, and markedly less so for boys. So boys are very frightened of coming forward and telling people that they have been abused in any way. So the first thing was we just saw a lot of people not getting into the system or falling out of the system. And that is problematic given that we know that we need to heal children and families who've been abused if we want to stop it from happening to other children.
To break the cycle.
To break the cycle.
So Kath, you also work, you have your NGO, you have a safe house and you foster children who have been victims of abuse. With regard to interactions with the system, some of the stuff that Lucy's saying, are these some of the things that you see and deal with?
Daily. So once the child's removed from the abuse or neglect or wherever they come from, they'll then come into, they first have to go to the hospital, get checked out, and then once the hospital's deemed them physically okay to come to our home, they then come to our home. However, if a social worker's got another 3 call-outs, sometimes they skip that call-out to the hospital and they come straight to us. They'll drop off kids and then they'll forget, like you said, to do the follow-up or whatever. And then we end up taking them, myself and my husband end up taking them to hospital for them. We see quite often that the kids coming in, and it's happening more and more frequently, that they also won't tell a doctor or the social worker what exactly has happened, because when they're leaving, the parents will be screaming and shouting, the neighbors will be out there, it's absolute chaos, and the kids get bundled into the car and driven away, and SAPs get left there to kind of calm the situation down. And these kids are so traumatized that the social workers are trying so desperately to calm them down that, you know, they don't really tell them how exactly they're feeling or, you know, what injuries they have. And only days afterwards will they come to us once Danny and I have assured them that they're safe, and, you know, we've fed them and we've clothed them and we've been there for them and been their people, and shown them what a normal family is. And they'll come to us quietly and they'll say to us, you know, this is what my mommy did, or I don't want to leave your house, I want to stay here forever because I like it, I like eating dinner. And we're like, you know, don't you get dinner? No. I have to go down the road and go try and find dinner, or I have to feed my sister, or, you know, there's always a thing. And a lot of the cases that we see as well is that the parents will get enough to do their drugs, and whatever's left, then she'll have to feed the husband because the husband's going to work the next day. So he'll get fed and the kids don't get fed because they'll go to school and they'll get something from school. But they're not telling school that they don't have food because they know they're going to get their mom into trouble or their dad into trouble. So it's just, it carries on and carries on. So when they get to us and they feel safe, they start telling us a lot more than what's happened. And then we've got to tell the social worker, and then we have meetings with social workers and explain everything that's happened. And a lot of the time, you know, it's like, well, it's not that bad. Maybe it's just poverty, or, you know, it's not that bad. We can maybe do family reunification. Family reunification ends up with kids, because there's no foster homes, they end up going to family, and parents can go and see their kids. They've still got free reign to see their children. And then again, the cycle doesn't break because you're just placing a broken child in a broken family, but this is a little bit better than what they were. So again, I mean, we try and work very closely with social workers to try and help them find a better solution, but it is difficult when there's not many solutions to give them.
Lucy, I want to come back to you because just on Kath's comment, not that bad, which is something that often in, you know, across the spectrum of abuse comes up over and over. And was the, and I'm not sure how detailed the 44% of reports that you found were, but did that come through at all in terms of how they prioritize different cases of child abuse? I know that you looked at both physical abuse and neglect and sexual assault. Were there any insights that came through there?
So one of the things that we found was that actually there was a marked difference between where cases get reported. So people tend to report sexual abuse to the police, and the police have very set protocols, procedures, steps that they must follow when a report of child abuse is made. And typically the police were very good at taking children to the hospitals for the examinations, to collect the evidence and for medical treatment. Where it falls down is that the police are supposed to then refer all their cases to social services, so that when children are abused, yes, they may have a need for medical treatment, but typically what is needed is that there needs to be ongoing therapeutic support for both the child and typically the family members. But the parents need information about how to deal with the responses that a child will have. So in cases of sexual abuse in South Africa, in Western Cape, most of that abuse is at the hands of someone the child knows, a family member, most likely, someone from their community. It's very rare that it's a stranger, someone that's absolutely unknown. So families need to know how to keep the child safe. They need to know how to deal with the behavioural changes that come as an inevitable consequence of having been abused. So as Valdi says, they need parenting skills. But now you've got a child who's been abused, so there are additional skills that the child and family need. And the problem is, in terms of the child protection system, is that the police are supposed to refer these cases to social services so they get that kind of parenting and therapeutic support. But we found that in the majority of cases, So in over 90% of cases, they did not refer, which means that families aren't getting that support. And it's critical if we want people to fully recover. And why weren't we then went and asked, well, why don't you refer? And we had a particularly shocking case of chronic sexual abuse with a 6-month-old baby. There is no clearer case for doing a referral. And the police hadn't referred on to social services or therapeutic services. And we asked why. Surely, in this case, it was clear that you needed to get other professionals involved to help and support the child and the family. And the bottom line was that their repeated experience was of not getting service. Their repeated experience was of being let down. They showed me 10 cases in the same month that had been referred from that department and asked me to go and ask the social workers if they had those cases. Social services couldn't find a single one of those cases that the police had said they had referred. And let's not put the blame on social services. The same experience we found of that lack of referral, the lack of trust, the disappointment and frustrations were across all service providers.
Because then, sorry, and then the hospital should have then also had the social worker inside there help the family as well.
But the hospital social workers, so we have what
so
are
ladies,
called...
before we go into that, we need to take a quick break.
Sure.
So let's do that and when we come back. Welcome back. Tonight we're in studio speaking about the child protection system and how child abuse cases are processed through that system. And Lucy and Kath were actually just speaking about the referral system, where police should ideally be referring cases, and especially cases of sexual abuse, to social services for counselling and other some other supportive support. And Kath, you jumped in by just saying, speaking about hospitals also, and sort of healthcare workers and their referral system.
Because it's just as important. I mean, you know, I think that if you've got the baby in the hospital, and a lot of the times the social workers do their rounds, and the doctors are then meant to tell the social worker what's going on and who needs help, and they then refer them back to whichever outside social worker office is in charge of that area where the family lives, so that they can do house calls and house visits and see the family and everything. Again, the problem is once that social worker calls the other social worker to take the baby home or put it into foster care or whatever, it would then transfer. So I think a lot of the time SAPS finds it very difficult to speak to that social worker when they know that that social worker is not going to be the case file in the social worker office anymore, because social worker at the hospital is not going to take over the case, and that's what, you know, should be happening. Again, we've got a case at the moment where SAPS and social workers are busy fighting over a case because we've got a child who was horrendously abused. And because both of them can't come to an agreement and they can't find out what's happening, we're waiting with this child who hasn't really, you know, gotten the help that he needed. So we're now left trying to pick up the pieces, and we're only a 90-day stay facility. So we don't keep children long-term in safety other than our 5 foster children. So you can't do much in 90 days, and it's going to be a long-term thing that you need. But you need all the parties to come together, and we're finding it's very difficult to get everyone to work together because everybody's got different rules. And no one understands the rules that you've got, no one understands the rules that you've got, no one understands the rules that I've got until you sit down and you explain it. But then you've got many, many, many other players as well that need to understand the same rules. And everybody has a different idea as to how those rules should be played out and what the laws are. So they don't always get played out to the exact way that we feel they should be for the children. either, because you've got the Child Care Act, and then you've got the law, and then you've got this, and you go, well, the magistrate's not going to accept that, and there's so many different things that they then end up having these children stay in safety for another 90 days, and then another 90 days, because they just don't know where to put this broken child. So at the end of the day, the only one suffering is this poor child, or, because now you've taken them away from their family, and you've taken away from everything, and the families carry on. They have to. There's nothing else they can do. Where the child's waiting for their family, and they're waiting to try and work out where they fit in.
Well, I wanted to come to you anyway, because what I also find interesting is that all the processes are interlinked. So next process is also the justice system. And what seems to be a knock-on effect of the child protection, of the delays, is actually delayed reporting, sometimes not even the child's fault, how the child discloses the trauma and the effect on the child when it eventually goes to trial. And I just want to ask you, in your experience, how an inefficient system might affect the child as well as the case.
Absolutely, it's huge, because 9 out of 10 times, as the report revealed, cases are dismissed because there's a lack of evidence, or the evidence is not sufficient. And when the justice system dismisses a case, the impact on the child and the family is not taken into account. Because that same perpetrator, who maybe stayed in the home of the mother, is maybe now going to go and move to another place in that same community. That child's life must go on. The mother's life must go on. The father's life must go on, as if nothing has happened. And you see this perpetrator standing out there and laughing and joking that they got away from it. And what does that breed? That breeds angry, aggressive children. And we constantly on social media see the WhatsApp, and we see these videos going viral of children who are now taking pics of fights and so on. Are we really questioning deeply enough where that aggression goes to harm? And so this is one of the impacts of unresolved trauma, of not gaining justice. That you don't go into positive coping mechanisms. You move into negative coping mechanisms. And so I've, in the Lavender Hill area where we've also worked, we've seen a lot of children tell us why they move into gangs. And very often it's about revenge. And it's shocking when a 5-year-old say, nee juffrou, ek gaan saam met die gangsters, want ek het nou die rot poison vat, en maak ek lekker koekies, en gee ek het vir hulle, ek gaan vir hulle trek. 5-year-old telling you that. 5-year-old working out how revenge will be meted out. And I think that is the shock. But I want to come back to the fact that we are dealing with such a broken system on a number of different levels. So now we talk around referral. And now, because the cases happened in the southern suburbs, you must probably go and refer to either an NGO in the southern suburbs or to the district office in the southern suburbs. Now, you are obviously going to be referring not to a psychologist, not to a clinical social worker, but to a generalist social worker who is not even grounded in understanding trauma, in understanding violence, and understanding the link between and how to deal with it. You are confronted with that. Then if you are dealing with a government social worker, their mandate is to only see that child and the mom for 2 sessions. What do you do in that 2 sessions? You hear the story,
Yeah.
you hear it, you question, there's an emotional explosion, and then you say, I'm going to refer you to another social worker. You get another social worker, and then she looks at the case, tell me again what has happened. So you re-trigger the trauma, because now I told it for a second time. Then the social worker realizes, hold it, this is out of my depth. So when we come to that 6-month-old baby, a generalist social worker will not be able to deal with that. Forensic social worker will deal with it from a different angle. But who really supports the baby and the mom in terms of the deeper recovery? We only have a few specialist organizations like Teddy Bear. And they are inundated with these kinds of things. What really shook me was these cases of, especially if we look at the early childhood development phase, how did these cases come out? And now when you look at our creches, we deal with teachers who are not schooled in this kind of sexual violence. And they are not aware of the legislation around children. So now you are looking after that 6-month-old, you've cleaned the 6-month-old's diaper, you've seen alles is nie reg nie. But you don't go and call the policeman because you feel you must report to the parent. But we don't realize that the parent may be the perpetrator. And you don't realize that there are a limitation to rights. That the child's needs come first above all. And then you will get the teacher will say, I know I must report it. But when you come to the principal says, no. Just tell the mother and they must do it because we don't want to ruin the reputation of our school. So it's so deep, it's so deep in terms of not only the poor collaboration that we're having, the challenges we're having in the referral system, but it's also deep in terms of how sure are we that the service providers that the children need, that they are well trained, well equipped, well resourced to deal with these things. So we tend to think, oh, we referred you 10 days ago and why didn't we get an appointment? When you talk to that social worker, she will tell me, no, but I had to go and do these home visits and I had to do this. I never had a chance. And so you sit with this problem.
The facilities that can help these children, like you said, there's ones in Tableview as well, and there's private counsellors as well. They are so full that the waiting list is up to 3 months.
6.
So
Up to 6 months in some places.
So for me to make a booking, first of all, a safe house can't make a booking, a foster family can't make a booking, only the social workers can make the booking. And then you've got to wait for that social worker who's got anything up to 1,000 cases on her desk that she's got to get up to, or they've got to get through. And that case is like, okay, this is high priority, we'll put it down here, and then I've just got to do this one because they're going to come now. And by the time you look, there's 10 more cases on top of that one that was meant to get the booking. There's just too many cases. There's far too many.
So we don't have very much time left, but I just want to come to one thing that Valdi said in both is in the report, and you were speaking about sort of the mandate for reporting, teachers not reporting and reporting to parents, even though this parent's not realizing the parent could be the perpetrator. And Lucy, in the report, there was, it was actually stated that there seemed to be a reluctance on the part of social workers to take action against parents who might be perpetrators of abuse. So could you tell us a bit more about those findings?
So there's a reluctance on behalf of everyone to deal with this topic. Exactly. So it starts with children are indoctrinated. We see violence as a normal part of their experience. So they don't know that there's something that they need to report until they experience something different. Then within families, families typically hide the abuse. We don't want, we've got people say, lock them up and throw away the key. But actually, when it's your son or your daughter, your reaction is different. So typically, granny says to the grandchild who's just said, uncle's doing things he shouldn't be doing to me. Granny says, don't you tell anyone, you'll be fine. So it's not just the social workers. The police turn these children away because they don't have the specialists, or that, it's normalized in terms of how we think of it. The social workers are saying, I can't take on another case, so we'll only deal with the worst cases. Well, we build up people's exposure to violence, and if we don't respond, those cases become more and more severe, and those children themselves become perpetrators. We're seeing that, police commanders, social workers are not referring, are not taking on. So are the prosecutors. We see magistrates daily. We've got minimum sentencing legislation in this country. Daily we see perpetrators not given the minimum sentence, or the cases being dismissed, because it's embedded deep in people's belief systems that actually, when we're faced with a case, it's not as bad as we think it is. But when you look at the long-term effects, then yes, it is. We've got to see the connection between all of these different cases and all of the violence that we see. So getting professionals to recognize violence, because a lot of people just don't see it anymore.
But I think also, SAPS and the people that are being reported to see so many cases being withdrawn all the time. Yeah. So what will happen is we're now in such a society where weekends we get drunk, we have a tiff and a fight, and my husband will beat me or whatever. I'll go and lay a charge on the Sunday, because now I've got a black eye. And then Monday morning I'm like, he's got to go to work. Yeah. I don't work, I have to feed my family now. Okay, no, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to. The police forced me to lay a charge against them. I don't want to do it. And that happens every single weekend. So when something really bad happens in that community now, not just in that family, but in that community, SAPS are like, no, you guys sort it out yourself. We're not getting involved now because we know what's going to happen later. And they've started to build like such a precautionary boundary wall kind of thing, where they're too scared to open up cases because they know it's just going to be a waste of their time. Where down the road they've got a child or a woman that's been raped or abused, or a man that's been stabbed or whatever, that they should rather be dealing with, but now they're dealing with Mr. and Mrs. whoever with their little tiff. So again, I think that it's become such a norm to withdraw cases all the time that SAPS are now not listening to the real story because they know they're guessing what's going to happen. And it's not meant to happen like that.
But the other thing that we've got to recognize is that many of these professionals, social workers and police officers, have their own trauma that they are carrying. And that affects their ability to deal with those cases. First of all, they have what is called compassion fatigue. So we stop feeling sorry for children. We stop feeling sorry for women. We stop being able to recognize the pain and the damage that people are experiencing. We're seeing high levels of burnout. They've just got too many cases and too much work and not enough time, and there are not enough resources, so I'll not bother. So getting back to being able to heal those professionals, being able to recognize violence and thinking that it's important is a critical first step. And Valdi, you said we have to all look at our own experience of violence, about how we have been both victims and perpetrators in our own lives. And the same is true. The budgets aren't suddenly going to increase. No. There aren't suddenly going to be lots of new social workers, lots of new police officers, lots of new children's homes. No. So in that circumstance, where do we start? How do we make a difference? And I think you had it right when you say the first thing that we all, as parents, as professionals, as community leaders, have to start with is that question about me.
You know, there's so much more that we can in this show that we can share. But I think for me, you know, when we ask, so where now? Where do we go to now? And I think we must firstly acknowledge, because very often we view what is happening to our children through a physical violence lens. And very often we forget the invisibility of violence in terms of the systemic and structural nature of violence. And so we need to get to the one level for me, which is our public sector within government, are we ready across the spectrum, not only social workers, I'm talking prosecutors, I'm talking defense, I'm talking magistrates, the health system, our nurses, our NGO sector. Don't forget our NGO sector. We're not just one homogeneous group that has everything together. We also have our challenges. So on a systemic level, how are we beginning to reflect? And I'm hoping that the Child Institute will move to another level after this, to begin to ask those police officers, those defense attorneys, the prosecutors, etc., all of those workers who are part of the support system that the child needs, what are they going through? What impacts on them? What leads you not to implement the plan of action for children? What is it? Is it just resources? Is it capacity building? What is it? And from where I'm sitting, it's a bit of everything. But one of the biggest challenges we have is that SAPS does not understand the legislation framework for children to the extent that they can take their national instructions and their standard orders and link it to the rights of the child. So for example, you get a 10-year-old child who's suicidal, and the child doesn't want to go for the suicidal watch at 𝗬𝗀𝗀𝗀, and child doesn't want mom to know. Mental Health Act will tell us, you take responsibility, the child is closed for you, you must take the child to the hospital. But when the child is not prepared to go to the hospital, because if I go to the hospital and I must get the 72-hour watch, then obviously mommy will begin to know what's happening. But I want to commit suicide because of the child and neglect and the abuse that I'm experiencing at home. And I've tried talking to my teacher, I've tried talking to this one, nobody's listening. So my next option is just to die. And now the last thing is they come into the center and they say, here I am and I'm going to kill myself. Now we try to take you there, we don't. Now we need to phone SAPS, and we need SAPS now to implement the Mental Health Act, which says that you must now involuntarily take the child over. And then they come and they first want to interrogate the child. No, that's not your job. Your job is simply to take. So we have a system that is broken, and we have a system that is broken and we are in denial. We don't want to fix that. If you don't fix the systemic issues that will always layer down into the level where you have the service providers who need to do that.
And that brings us, actually, I'm sorry, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us and for this robust conversation. I hope that there will be another episode to fast take it further. And we shall take another break and be back after this. That's all we have for this evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lenina Rassool. Good night.